So, good morning, everybody. I will continue on the chapter about migration and specifically about internal migration. There's a technical thing here. My video is zoomed out just because the camera is not working to zoom in, but actually that doesn't make any difference. What matters more is the content of the slides. And in the previous class, I finished on this topic about migration transition and kind of emphasizing that migration transition related to internal migration is pretty much the process of urbanization, right? People moving from rural areas to urban areas, and then in more recent decades, in more developed countries such as the US, people start to move from urban areas to other urban areas, to suburbs, or even to mid-sized cities that provide good quality of life and the same kind of services as big cities. And this process of migration transition, how the process of people moving from one place to the other, it involves actually a process and a transformation, right? The process is pretty much that flow, the continuous flow of people that might vary from one year to the other, moving from one place to the other in a specific time point. So how many people moved, for example, from California to Texas between 2021 and 2022? We are trying to understand this recent flow and how did these flows vary comparing to previous years? Is Texas receiving more people nowadays from California or from other places? And we are trying to understand how many people are entering in each one of the specific time points. So it's people moving from one place to another within a specific time interval. After all this process of several years or decades of people moving from one area to the other, this migration flow creates a change both in the areas of origin and destination. It transforms the area of origin and the area of destination. And in order to understand this overall transformation, we have to see the migration stock. So how many people right now living in Texas were not born in Texas, but were born in other states in the US? Some of them might have migrated several years ago, decades ago. Some of them might have entered these last 2 years, for example. So after all these flows of migration from one area to the other, how is the area of destination composed by migrants? What's the overall number of migrants in the area of the destination? That's the migration stock. But with like census data and also the American Community Survey, we also know how many people were born in a specific place and left to live somewhere else. For example, I can also know, using the Census Bureau data, how many people were born in Texas but now are living in some other place in the US. I don't have the data to know how many are living outside of the US, but I know internal migration, how many were born in Texas and how many are living somewhere else in the US. So after all this process, these flows of people moving from one area to the other in a specific time point, now at a specific time period, how many people overall are in this area and they were not born here? They migrated here from somewhere else. And we can also do the same analysis about the areas of origin. So the migration stock refers to the amount of migrants in areas of origin and destination at a specific time after all these previous population flows that happened in previous years and decades. So this understanding of flows and stock is important because they give different information about how a specific population is. Maybe California has still a lot of people that were not born in California, were born in other states in the US, and now live in California. So there is this big population stock there. But in more recent years, California has not been attracting as many internal migrants as they did before, because it's expensive to live there, it's not so easy to find jobs, and then people start to go to other states. So the migration stock might be large in California. I'm just talking about internal migrants, I'm not talking about international. But the recent flows might not be so pronounced as they were in the past, okay? And when we are trying to understand migration, we can also come up with these different frameworks, diagrams, conceptual models to understand why people migrate, right? So we are trying to understand why people decide to migrate. And that final move of people from one place to the other is related to their intentions and is related to the motivations to migrate. So the decisions to migrate are influenced by motivation to migrate, by the benefits of migration, the cost of migration. Okay, I might decide to move from a small town in Texas, where all my family is, into a bigger town. I want to move to Houston, where I'm going to have better job opportunities. And if I move to Houston, the benefits are that I will have better earnings, I will be able to provide maybe better education to my children, maybe the schools there have better ratings than the schools back in my small town. But there are costs too, right? Of course, transportation here within Texas is kind of affordable to everybody, even if those don't have cars can take a bus. But it's not just a matter of transportation. It's also you are leaving behind maybe other family members and you are moving on with specific individuals from your nuclear family. And maybe you're going to make more money in the bigger city, but the cost of housing, it's higher. Property taxes are higher, right? Rent is higher if you're just going to rent. Food might be more expensive. I'm going to have to buy a car. I'm going to have to commute a lot. I will have to drive a lot. So we spend a lot on gas, something that I didn't do when I lived in a small town. So there are a series of different costs and benefits of migration that motivate the final decision to migrate. And in this specific portion here, I'm talking about internal migration, but you could also think the same model for international migration. People moving from one country to the other, you might say, oh, the US is going to be a place where I'm going to have better opportunities to work, but I will have to leave behind all my family in Latin America, for example, and I will be much more secluded in a smaller group, not so much of a social network. So I have to kind of put the costs and benefits in a balance and see which one is stronger, and then I make the final decision to migrate. And this analysis of like the costs and benefits of migration are influenced by a series of different characteristics: individual, household, and community level characteristics. So individual human capital attributes, experience in the labor market, educational attainment. And if I don't have if I'm trying to estimate a model like that, and I don't have the information of how many years people are in the labor market, I can get their age as an approximation of probably how many years they have been in the labor market. So I can have, if I have experience in the labor market. If I don't, I can get simply age, I can get education, and I can get other individual level characteristics. What's the occupation of that person, and marital status, race, ethnicity, and sex, everything. I can try to see what are the individual characteristics of people that might be making them evaluate that migration has more benefits than costs, and then they will finally decide to migrate. And also individual risk-taking traits. I mean, one thing, usually surveys, they don't ask so straightforward questions about whether you are more prone to risk opportunities in order to improve your life, like kind of like a, let's say, scale of entrepreneurship like that, or scale of risk taking. So you use some other variables that we usually collect. And some of these variables are related to the occupation that people have. We can ask experience in the labor market, like I said before, and we can ask all these other individual level characteristics that differentiate people and might make them more likely to migrate. Household characteristics, resources, household family migration norms. Do I live in a household that's rented or owned? If it's owned, I'm less likely to move out. If I rent it, I'm more likely to move to another place. So this basic variable that I have in a lot of like the Census Bureau databases I can use in my analysis. How many rooms I have in the household per capita. Pretty much like, let's divide all the number of rooms that I have in the household by the number of people, or vice versa, how many people by rooms. Some measure of the size of the household for the number of people that live there. Does the neighborhood, the area where the household is located, have access to treated water, sewer system, and all that? It has a school nearby. It has health services around it. And actually, in that case, we start to move into community characteristics, right? What's the area around my household? Do I have easy access to good schools, to health services to my family? Do I have grocery stores and all that? So all these community characteristics might influence people move to another area where they would have better access to those services. And migration networks. I might live in the same conditions as my neighbor, but maybe I have friends and relatives that moved to another city in another state in the US, and they told me about some job opportunities. They talked to their boss there and they found a job for me. I might have all similar characteristics as my neighbor in the place we are living right now, but maybe because of this network, friends and family that already moved to another place, that will make me more likely to decide to migrate, right? So whenever we are trying to understand the decision to migrate, the model can become really complex. And it's a matter of data availability, right? Usually we don't have all these variables in the same database. We have to get data from different sources in order to understand why individuals or areas are more likely to have people migrating out or into those areas, okay? This diagram here, elaborated by Bernard Bell and co-authors, they pretty much trying to make a parallel to that, the fertility proximate determinants. Remember the fertility proximate determinants, the one that Bongers elaborated, in which you had a series of contextual factors that influence some proximity determinants that influence the chances of women having children or not. And some of the most important proximate determinants is that individual married, it's that individual, did she ever had an abortion, is that person, that woman in a postpartum period, she's breastfeeding the baby. So married, abortion, postpartum period are some examples of proximate determinants that will influence and use of contraception, right? Married, contraception, abortion, postpartum period. Those are kind of like the most important proximate determinants that make women more likely or less likely to decide to have children. And those proximate determinants are influenced by contextual factors. So what Bernard and Bell do here, they try to replicate, think in terms of proximate determinants to understand the chances of migrating, right? So we can calculate what is the migration rate by age group. Let's say I estimate the migration rate of people, I can even do it for children as well, from 0 to 85 plus. And I can estimate that for each 5-year age group. And then I see that some ages you have higher chances to migrate than others. And then I try to understand what are the factors influencing them. And the proximate determinants to migration they list here are what they call these life course transitions. So the age in which people enter mostly higher education, right? When people reach 17, 18 years of age and they get into college age, it's really likely that they might go to a college, and this is really clear in the US, in another town. So the chances of migrating will increase once they enter in college, in higher education. And after they finish college, they might also move somewhere else where they will try to find a job or get married and form a family. So the chances of migrating increases. And when people have the first job, and that applies both for people who don't have a college and those that have a college. People, when they start working, they are more likely to move from one place to the other, to the place where they got a job offer. When people get married, they are more likely to migrate, right? But then after that, when they start to have children, then they start to form a family in a specific place, then they start to be less likely to migrate. Their children later on, when they enter into college age, they might migrate. But now, my family with children will be less likely to migrate. People, when they divorce, they might change their life and they may also more likely to migrate than if they don't get divorced. And when children go to college, the children, the chances of migrating are high. But even the parents, because the parents might decide to move to a smaller town to have a bigger house, or the opposite, I want to move to a bigger city and have a smaller house to don't have to take care of my backyard and so on, right? And also when people retire, there is a higher chance of people migrating from one place to the other. And all these proximate determinants, they are influenced by general contextual factors related to how the society is organized, related to economic opportunities, right? We have a lot of job availability in a specific area and not in another. And where I live, we don't have as many job opportunities. There is a lot of unemployment because of these major economic trends that will influence me moving to another area because of labor force reasons, right? I'm trying to find another job. Demographic, cultural, religious. High demographic, maybe I live in an area that there is a high proportion of people in labor ages for the amount of jobs available there. So I decide to move to another area exactly to trying to find better jobs. Cultural, do I live in an area which is more common for people to move out and then try to get a higher education somewhere else because we don't have in that specific place, or because I want to get married, right? Religious, maybe some more conservative communities, they prefer to live around themselves. So they might be less likely to migrate from that area. Or if they migrate, might be just a temporary migration. They move to a place, maybe get a college education, and they go back to their hometown, right? So all these contextual general factors influence these life course transitions, and then the life course transitions influence migration. I was the committee chair, a committee member for a Brazilian student doing his PhD a couple of years ago, and he used Brazilian data to analyze the association between life course transitions and migration. And he focused exactly on education completion, entrance into the labor market, getting married, and having a child. So these four, only four, and the influence on migration. And he did that analysis for a series of different flows, intra-regional flows, interstate, and so on. And that became his dissertation. So it's not trivial to implement this approach into a research project, right? It demands a lot of data analysis and a lot of time to develop this. But the overall framework for the approximate determinants of migration, it's really well defined here by Bernard Bell and Charles Edwards. Cool. And this is just an example, a theoretical example of the migration rates by age group. Like I told you, right? We can estimate how many people between the ages of 0 and 4 migrated from one place to the other within a country in the last year, divided by all people between the ages of 0 to 4. So we calculate all these rates the same way that we calculate the age-specific mortality rates, the age-specific fertility rates. We can estimate the age-specific migration rates, and it can be age-specific internal migration rates. How many people in one specific age group migrated from one area to the other, divided by the number of people in that age group. The denominator here are people at risk of experiencing the event being estimated in the numerator. And the typical curve of migration rates by age groups is this one here, right? So you have children. Usually these rates here of children vary a lot from country to country, right? Countries in which you have children migrating with their parents, this curve here tends to be more similar to this one. So for example, here in the US, for example, you might see that the migration of young children might be a little bit more steep because they're migrating with their parents. In China, like I said, they have some regulations. People cannot migrate from a rural to urban area without the government approval. If they do migrate, they don't have access to health services, to education, and to the formal labor market. So a lot of those that do move within China without the approval of the government, they leave their children behind and other members of their family. So the rates of children here do not mirror the rates of their parents. But once people enter higher education around the ages of 18, 17, their chances of migrating increases. And also around the ages of 23, 22, they also, when they finish college, their chances of migrating increases a lot. When they enter the labor market, also really high chances to migrate from one place to the other. And then it starts to decline. People get married, start to have children, start to get settled, and then the chances of migrating decline. Even if they change jobs, they might change job in the same community, and their children leave their household. These children here, if you analyze them, they will be here entering higher education, but that specific household, their chances of migrating declines. Once people retire, we might see also an increase in the chances of migrating, but then keeps declining. And then people in older ages might need to move to institutions to have health services provided to them. And then the chances of migrating might increase as well. So you see how the migration rates by age vary because of these different life transitions, these life course transitions that people experience throughout their life, okay? And this is an example of internal migration rates for China, Portugal, and Brazil. And in this case here, they calculated 5-year interval data to understand migration. This is data from, I think it's from this 2010 census. And here in the census, what the question is asked is like, where do you live right now? And exactly 5 years ago, where did you live? And based on that information, if 5 years ago you were somewhere else and now you are in this other place, then you are a migrant. If 5 years ago I was in the same place as now, I'm not a migrant. So that's why these graphs here are based on this 5-year internal migration data. In the US, the American Community Survey, that survey that happens every year, the question is, where did you live exactly 1 year ago, right? And the census in the US, the decennial census, the one that happens every year, does not have the question about migration, right? Since 2010, it's all, the US census doesn't ask information about migration, and that question about migration, it's only available on the American Community Survey, which started in 2005, and we have data until now. The latest data is from 2020. So you have this information of migration that you can estimate those graphs. And then you see, in China, exactly related to their culture, to their system, the government regulates whether people are allowed to move from rural to urban areas. Of course, even if the government says, no, if you don't get the approval, we won't provide, you won't be able to access all these services in the destination, education for your children, health services for you, and the formal labor market. But people might keep migrating because they see better opportunities in urban areas. Then they can send money back to their family who stay behind. And exactly because of their family stay behind, because they want their children to have access to health services and to education, they stay back in the area of origin. The chances of children migrating, it's really low. And you see that it starts in younger ages, people are starting to migrate. People start to migrate early, exactly because going into entering school, and also because of people entering the labor market, all connected here. And then the chances of migrating increase until around the age of 24, right? 24 here or 23, and then starts to decline again. And you see a little bump here around the ages of 75 and 80. If you look in Portugal, then you see that the chances of children migrating up to the age of 15 See, it's not so flat as we saw in China. It's a little bit more steep. It kind of a little bit resembles the migration of the parents. So these are parents moving with their children, right? But as these children get older, start to enter school around the ages of 18, start to move, and then get a job, move, the chance of moving is also big. And then afterwards, you start to settle with your family, and the chances to move declines, and then increases again at older ages, exactly because of people retiring or moving to institutions. In Brazil, overall, it's the variation by age group based on this data from 2010 is not so pronounced. It's much more like flat comparing to Portugal and China. So that means that the chances of migrating from one age group to the other are more similar than it is in China and Portugal. And the rates of children here resemble the rates of their parents. But once they get into college age and start to migrate, it increases, but not so pronounced as in Portugal and China. And why that happens? Maybe because people still, a really low percentage of people go to the university, to universities in Brazil. Only around 13, 15% of the population has a college education. So not as many people migrate because of going to college. And now what happens is that people, those that decide to go to college might go to college nearby their home city, right? So they might not migrate far away from that area. And then the chances of migrating doesn't increase as much. But around the ages where people complete higher education, that's where you have the higher chances of migrating, and then it declines again, right? And you don't see as a pronounced increase in older ages, as you saw a little bit here in China, and as you saw here in Portugal, right? So really basic data here of migration rates by age for 3 countries, and you have to understand what are the contextual factors of each one of those countries to understand the rates. You have to comprehend the context to understand the rates of migration. This is the case of the US. In here you see that the chances of people moving within the US at younger ages is really high. So this one really is really similar to the rates of their parents. So these are parents here moving with their children. And as people enter around the ages of 18, 17, 18, enter college, the chances of migrating increases and then reaches the high peak of migration of around 25 years of age, when people graduate and go get the first job, and then it declines, and it decreases again at older ages. And in this graph here that's available in the textbook, we have both data related to the household population and the total population. So the pink curve, it's treating the households as the unit of analysis. The red curve is each individual as the unit of analysis. And kind of like, it's interesting that here is pretty much showing that exactly because only some individuals in the household might move because they are going to college, the rates here for the individuals are higher than the household. And later in life too, because some individuals might need to move to institutions because of health reasons, the rates of individuals is higher than the household because just some members of the household might move, not all members. But these children here, when they migrate, they usually migrate with the full household because they're dependents, right, of their parents. So the pink and red curve, they're pretty much the same level. And here too, this is the whole household moving, all individuals moving together related to more the family. So the rates are much more similar, right? And you see this discrepancy exactly for migration related to education. That's only some in the household we move, not the whole household. And when people get older, need health system, only some individuals might move, not the whole household. Okay? So as I'm saying, talking here, internal migration is a geographical move resulting in a change of residence that crosses a political or jurisdictional boundary. In the US, internal migrants are those who migrate from one country to the other. As we talk about a migration transition, internal migration is a story of rural population increases. And then even if that population overall is not so large, but the number of people is big enough to the few resources that they have, so people decide to look for jobs in urban areas. But like I mentioned, in the US and Western Europe, more developed countries that have most of their area, most of the population lives in urban areas, then people start to move between urban areas. And this process is usually called migration evolution. It's pretty much people migrating from one urban area to the other. It's not rural or urban so much anymore. Maybe people are moving now from the big cities to mid-sized cities because the cost is lower and we can have the same services and education to our children available there, right? And just a little difference between mover and a migrant. Any person who changes his or her residence is a mover, but not all movers are migrants because a person can move within the same community without involving the crossing of political boundary. So if you say that a migrant is going to be considered a migrant only if they move from one county to the other, that means that people moving within a specific city, within a specific county, only between neighborhoods, that person in your analysis might not be considered a migrant, but a mover. All migrants are movers because the residential move of a migrant involves the move from at least one county to the other. And another example of mover is commuting, right? Some people might live in Austin and come here to College Station to work as professors at Texas A&M, go back to Austin. Some people might live in Houston, come here, go back to Houston. That can be a daily commute, or people might stay here for a couple of days, but most of their belongings, when they file, for example, income tax and everything, they will report living, for example, in Austin or Houston and not College Station, right? So that's another example of a mover who is not a migrant. A migrant moves from one county to the other, and the migrant will move from one county to the other and moves all their belongings. The whole household moves there with them. That's the main residence. The Census Bureau estimated that a person in the US may move around 12 times in their lifetime. Of course, this 12 times here is the average. Some people might move more or less than that. And migration has consequences in the society as a whole. So when people migrate, there is an impact on receiving and sending communities. The area of origin typically loses young adults, which can slow down population growth in those areas. So you start to see in some rural areas that are losing a lot of population, they might have problems with economic stagnation, not enough people working and producing there. The host area, the areas of destination, gains those young adults, which can increase population growth and actually increase the percentage of people in younger ages. This migration process also even internal migration creates the process of people sending money for those relatives that stayed back in the origin. So remittances from migrants back to the sending communities have become important to economies in those places. Maybe remittances is not a big deal for internal migrants within the US, people moving within the US, but it is a big thing in China, people moving from rural to urban areas, those that move, send money back to rural areas, to the family members that stay there. And if you talk about international migration, Latin Americans, Asians moving to the US, they work here and send money back to their relatives that stayed back in their country of origin. So remittances are important. It changes. It's something that makes change not only the area of destination, but also the area of origin of those migrants. Cool? Now, just going a little more on these concepts and definition related to migration. Some of these I have already gone through here, so we'll go a little bit quicker. A permanent residential move, either local or jurisdictional, is usually defined as a change of residence lasting at least 1 year. So one person to be considered a migrant, that person has to be living in that area of current residence for at least 1 year. The residential migration of persons moving to a specific area of destination is called in-migration. If I'm trying to understand, I have a family, the Smith family, migrating from California to Texas. And I want to understand if that migration, how that migration affected the area of destination, Texas. I'm doing an analysis of the effects of in-migration. What about if I want to do the opposite? I want to see the effect of those families getting out of the California state and how that might affect California, that now more people are moving out and might affect the number of people in labor ages. I want to understand if that migration has an influence on the area of origin. In that case, I'm doing an analysis of out-migration. What about I want to understand people that migrated from the south in the US, went to the north, and now are coming back. So I'm doing an analysis of return migration, right? It is possible that a migrant might move back to their area of origin throughout their life. So I want to understand that as well. All this here, I'm talking in terms of internal migration, right? I'm not talking about people moving from one country to the US and then going back. You can also do analysis about that. Immigration, immigration, and return migration. But that can also be done in studies about internal migration. And just to emphasize, I think this table I showed to you before in the class about theories of demography. Internal migration, people moving permanently from one area to the other within a country, international between countries. If I'm trying to understand internal migration within countries, and I'm trying to understand the effects in the area of destination, I'm doing an analysis of in-migration. If my focus is how those migration flows affect the sending areas, the areas of origin, I'm doing an analysis of out-migration. If I'm doing migration between countries, focus on destination, immigration. Focusing on the effects on area for origin, immigration. In the US, we usually give a lot of emphasis to studies related to immigration, how international migrants change the US society, the US economy, right? But I could also say we have a lot of people in labor ages getting out of Asia and Latin America coming to the US. How that affect the areas of origin, losing so many workers, right? And this is going through some examples of measurement in migration, net migration, and gross migration. When we get all people who move into specific areas in migrants, subtract by those that left, we have net migration. So this number can be positive, negative, or zero. More people moving in than moving out, positive. More people moving out than in, negative. Equal level, zero balance. But I also might try to understand, oh, maybe one area has a lot of migration in and out. So there is a lot of movement. So if I just analyze net migration, I will not capture this really fluid flow of people moving from one place to the other. So in order to get that really fluid dynamic of people moving from one place to the other, I might estimate gross migration, the overall number of people that moved in and moved out, add them up just to see how is that area receiving and losing people over a specific time period. And the migration efficiency is pretty much dividing the net migration by the gross migration. So we say that migration is positively efficient if one area is receiving more people than losing, negatively efficient if more people are getting out and moving in, and inefficient if the levels of in and out migration are really similar, and this division, the migration efficiency, net migration divided by gross migration, tends to be 0, right? But in this case here, we are getting net migration divided by gross migration just to get how that in-out flow, the net migration, compares to the overall flow of people moving in and out in that country, or in that county, or in that specific state of a specific country. Migration stream, groups of migrants having a common area of origin and a common area of destination during a specified migration interval. So, for example, when there is the Great Migration in the US that I will talk to you guys in the portion of this chapter related to examples of internal migration in the US. African Americans moving out of the South states and going to the Northeastern states and to other areas in the country because of segregation, but because of discrimination that we're facing in the Southern states. So that's a migration stream. But once you created this migration stream, in this case, African Americans moving from Southern states to Northern states, people still have a link with the area of origin. So there is also a counter stream of people moving, African Americans moving from the Northeastern states into the Southern states, right? This overall flow is usually smaller, but it exists exactly because of this major stream from one area to the other. Migration interval is a temporal dimension of migration defined by the researcher. This usually is defined actually by the database that you're analyzing. If you use decennial census from several countries, the question is going to be, where did you live exactly 5 years ago? There is other two questions that could be asked too. Where did you live before the place of current residence? What's your previous place of residence? That's another question. And this previous place of residence is usually analyzed with another question. How many years do you live in the current place of residence? So in the decennial census, you might see these are the three main questions. Where did you live exactly 5 years ago? Where did you live before? And how many years do you live in your current place? And in surveys that happen every year, such as the American Community Survey, the question is, where did you live exactly 1 year ago? Okay? So actually, and then you decide how to analyze migration depending on how you have your data available, okay? And we usually try to understand migration by comparing areas of origin and destination. That's related to that diagram that I showed you before here, that the motivation and the decision to migrate are influenced also by contextual factors. So I might do an analysis of differences in migrant populations according to their demographic, social, and economic characteristics. So we have all, like in that framework that I showed you, the diagram, we have the individual, the household, and the community level characteristics, and I compare that with, I can, for example, compare what are the community level characteristics of the area of origin and destination. I can compare the average age of individuals moving in there compared to the age of individuals that already live there, or the age of the individuals that stay in the place of origin, did not migrate. So I can do a lot of different analyses there. The migration process is selective. Not everyone stays and not everyone moves. Usually, the chances of migrating are related to demographic characteristics. As I talked to you in that diagram, is related to age, sex, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, marital status, and so on. Whether people own their household or not. Age and education are major predictors of migrating. Americans age 18 to 14 are more likely to move due to events related to going to college or getting their first job, right? When they get into college, they graduate, get a new job, that's when the chances of migrating are really high. And why people migrate from one place to the other, we talked to you before here about theories of migration, that this major framework that tries to explain this migration is the push-pull framework, that there are factors in the areas of origin, negative factors that make people move out, pushes people away, and factors in the area of destination, positive factors that attract people, pull people into that area. When migrants are responding to positive pull factors in the area of destination, such as economic growth and high employment, these migrants tend to be positively selected. When migrants are responding to negative push factors in the area of origin, such as poverty, unemployment, violence, and so on, these migrants tend to be negatively selected. And they are less likely to have higher economic status than those responding to the pull factors, right? So an analysis of all these push and pull factors for specific flows might give you a lot of answers for a specific research project. But what is really important to emphasize is that migration is selective. Not everybody here has the same chances of migrating from one place to the other. The chances of migrating depends on our individual, household, and contextual characteristics, and also networks, right? If I know more people in other places, I will be more likely to migrate. Cool? This next portion of the chapter, talking about measures of migration. Some difficulties in measure migration are not encountered when we analyze fertility and mortality. Usually birth and death are collected at the time that the events happen, right? Birth, you have the birth certificate. Death, you have the death certificate. You can also ask questions about fertility and mortality in surveys. If a specific household, how many children live there, if the woman had a child in the last year, if someone in that household died in the previous year, and what age that person was when died. But usually, really important data for migration, for fertility and mortality are the ones collected with birth certificates and death certificates. In most countries, the residential move of a person is not registered at the time of occurrence. Few countries require people to register within the government when they move, such as in China and Scandinavian countries. So, whenever you're doing analysis of migration, it's necessary to rely on other types of data. In the US, one interesting source of data about migration is based on income tax form. So when people submit their income tax to the IRS, we put there our name, social security number, and also our address. And we do that every year, right? Now, it just happened now. The deadline was yesterday, Monday, right? April 15th. So yeah, it was yesterday, April 18th. So using that data from income tax, we can link these individuals over time because we have the Social Security number, and then we can see if people migrating from one area to the other in every single year. Still, we are not measuring migration exactly at the time that it happens, because we are based on information of residents based in April when people submit their income tax. But it's another kind of data that we can analyze migration in the US. The American Community Survey, as I mentioned, uses two items that were previously part of the decennial census. We have state of birth, and in the same question of state of birth, if the person was not born in the US, the person reports the country of birth. But since we are talking about internal migration, state of birth and place of residence 1 year prior to the date of the ACS. And like the census, the ACS date, the date of reference, like the census date is April 1st. So if you are answering the ACS in 2022, you are saying, how was your household or your conditions in April 1st? And exactly April 1st, 2021, 1 year ago, where were you living, right? And this question also captures if you were living in another country. Here, people that were born in another country report the country of birth. Here, people that 1 year ago were in another country, they report the country where they were 1 year ago. And that information can be used for international migration studies. But the same questions can also be used for internal, because we ask the state of birth and the place within the US where people was living exactly 1 year ago. And up to the 2000 decennial census, there was a question about place of residence 5 years ago, right? But then in the 2010 census, that question was not asked anymore in 2020. It got transferred to the ACS starting in 2005. And the question now, it's only, where did you live exactly 1 year ago? And in the US, both in these old censuses and in the ACS, there is no question, that other type of question that I mentioned to you. Where did you live before? What's the place of previous residence? And how many years do you live in this current residence? Those two questions are not asked in ACS. These two questions were not asked in the previous census that we had in the US. Why is that other question interesting? Because I could get someone that lived exactly 1 year ago. The person is right now in College Station. Maybe 1 year ago, that person was in New York. But I could ask that person, where did you live before College Station? That person might say, oh, I was in Florida. So 1 year ago, New York, now College Station, but before, that person was in Florida. So that's why the question about duration is important. So how many years do you live here in College Station? Oh, only 3 months. So we know that for 3 months, that person lives in College Station, came from Florida. And then in the other 9 months, that person was in New York. 9 months in New York, moved to Florida, stayed there, and then moved to College Station 3 months ago, okay? So it's just to explain, to give an example of, as we have more questions available about migration, we can capture more movements. In this case, this person was in New York 1 year ago, moved to Florida, and has been here for 3 months. We can capture more the complex of migration flows. But that we cannot do with ACS, because ACS just asks these two questions here. The IRS data, as I mentioned to you, has been used a lot by demographers, by the Census Bureau, to understand migration flows. It is administrative data, but the migration information is not captured exactly at the time of occurrence, such as with birth certificates and their death certificates. But at least you have that information about residents in April, around April 15th, okay? And this is just a table that I got it from this this paper published by Matt Hauer. Matt Hauer is that a professor at Florida State University in the sociology department. He's the one who made that funny video, like a cartoon, summarizing the theories of demography, the one that's available in our course website. And he published this paper, and he pretty much organized this IRS migration data into a clean database, because this migration data based on IRS databases, it's not homogenized, it's not organized across all the years. So he organized them all for this period between 1990 and 2016. So the ACS, the sample of the ACS, it has, the questionnaire is implemented to around 2 million households per year. And the sample is all, out of all households in the US, 2 million receive the questionnaire, but this 2 million will be representative to the whole population. And the coverage period is 2005 to 2020. So the latest ACS, the latest one, the 2020, had problems because of the pandemic. A lot of people not answering. So there is a lot of undercount. There are issues of representativeness by subgroups of race, ethnicity, usually more vulnerable groups. They did not respond. So they are less represented in the 2020 ACS. The overall count of ACS, of the population based on ACS 2020 was corrected by the Census Bureau. But if you break it down by subgroups, by race, ethnicity, by age, and so on, there are problems because of the pandemic. But the data from ACS is available from 2005 to 2020, right? When they were doing this paper here, they analyzed up to 2016. The time period reported, this data that they analyzed not the ACS for every single year, 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Since they did the analysis for smaller areas, they use what is called the 5-year estimates of ACS. So what the Census Bureau gets, it gets the years of, for example, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, put them together, and the data that you analyze is kind of an average of the period between 2005 and 9. And then you can compare to 2010 to 14, and then 15 to 19, right? So they analyzed that data. They did not analyze for this exercise here, the 1-year estimate. And the ACS has many other variables besides migration, right? We have information about relationship of each person in the household with the head of the household. Like, am I the head of the household, the spouse, the child, the grandparent, and so on? Household type, is it a rented or occupied or owned household? And we have information about age, sex, race, ethnicity, veteran status. We have income. We have a lot of information, social, demographic, economic variables in ACS. What about IRS? The sample size is much larger. It's not only 2 million households, it's 116 million at least households provide information to the IRS. And the universe is the universe of tax-filing households. But you could say, oh, so it will undercount, for example, people, students or undocumented immigrants, but even those people, they can file. Even students usually get, international students get a social security number. But even for those without the social security number, like undocumented immigrants, they can submit their income tax forms, right? And they submit with a tax ID. and that's common in the US. Data available from 1990 to 2016, and now up to 2020 or 2021. And so it covers a period wider than the ACS. And because of this really, really large sample size, we can do the analysis of county to county migration for every single year. If we want to analyze county to county migration with ACS, we have to use the 5-year estimates. We have to group, for example, 2005 to 2009, because the sample size is not so big. So we group 2005 and 2009 to understand county to county migration. Here, to understand county to county migration, I can do that for every single year separated, because I have a really big sample size. A limitation of IRS data is that it doesn't have any demographic characteristics. So I'm doing a project now at the Texas Research Data Center. That's the Census Bureau has around 25, 30 research data centers in the country in different institutions that we can access restricted data that's not public available. And Texas A&M has one of those. So if you just Google TXRDC, you're gonna find it. And it's located here in the TIG building by the Oceanography building, right? Just behind there. That's where it's located now. It used to be in West Campus and it's now close to us here. And having access to that data, I'm in a project that I'm trying to link these two sources of data to analyze county to county migration in the US. Kind of looking, the overall flow gives us this overall information of flows of migration from county to county. We can use IRS data for that. And if we want to understand more in detail the demographic characteristics of who is moving, we have to use ACS. So I'm trying to combine these two data sources in this research project. When we have all these different variables that we ask people, where did you move? Where did you live before? How many years you live in the current place of residence and so on, we can generate different variables that will give the people, will classify people as being migrants or not. So we can generate migration status using information on state of birth. If someone was born in another state and is now living in a different state, that person can be classified as a migrant. And that information about state of birth, I have to compare with the information of place of residence at enumeration time. At the time of the survey, or the time of the census, that person is living, residing in a place different than where they were born in another state, that person can be classified as a migrant based on this. Or if I have the ACS, I know where the person is living right now. And then I compare to where that person was living 1 year before. And see how that person is a migrant if where they live now is different where they were living 1 year before. If I'm using census data up to the 2000 census, I can get the information about where the person lived 5 years before and compare to where the person lives right now, okay? And based on these different variables, we can create different categories. This is just one example, right? Non-migrants would be someone that is living in a specific state and was born in that same state. So we could call those non-migrants. I could create another category that I would say, oh, those are lifetime migrants. They are living in a given state, but they were born somewhere else. Or they were born in a given state, but living in some other state. So they are living here right now, but they were born somewhere else. And if I want to analyze the out migration, I can see people who were born here and everybody who move out from here. So I can do analysis both about in and out migration. And this one here is called lifetime migrants because we are comparing where the person lives now and where they were born before. But what about people that moved in more recently? So I can use the information about place of residence 1 year ago based on ACS, where the person lived 5 years ago based on the census. But again, this variable here, this question here, available only up to the 2000 census. 2010 and 2020 census don't have that. So those are the recent migrants because they moved within this last year based on ACS data or in the last 5 years, according to the census, okay? So just an example of how we can categorize people based on these questions that we have access to. We have to be cautious with migration data. People could have moved from and back a state several times between birth and the time of the survey, right? So whenever you're analyzing it, we're analyzing these 2 time points. People could have moved to several different places in between the time that they were born and where they are now. The same caution applies to measure migration 5 years prior to the enumeration date. When we use data up to the 2000 census, we still have that information about 5 years ago. People could have moved to other places between these 5 years. Usually when we have ACS, where you live now and you live 1 year ago, the chances of people might have been going to a third place in between these two is lower, right? Because of this time period here of 1 year doesn't give them as much time to move to a third place. So usually you don't lose as many migration flows when you use this 1 year, the information of residents 1 year ago. Some examples of migration rates. So this is just really straightforward. The number of people that enter in a specific area divided by the population in the middle of the period in the destination. And this one here, people who moved out of a specific area, in the denominator, the population, in the middle of the period, in the area of origin. Demographically speaking, which one is the more appropriate rate? According to these formulas here, which one is the most appropriate formula? The in-migration rate or the out-migration rate? How do you estimate correctly demographic rate? What is the denominator? The denominator is the number of people who are exposed to the chance of experiencing the event being measured in the numerator, right? The number of people being exposed here, the correct way is the person years, right? The number of years that I was exposed to the chance of experiencing the event being measured in the numerator. Person years is hard to estimate, so we usually get the population in the middle of the period as an approximation for our denominator. So what did I say about the in-migration rate? I'm getting this area of destination here, counting how many people moved here, and dividing by the population in the middle of the period here in the destination. How did I measure out migration? I got all the people who moved out from here, and I divided by the population in the middle of the period of the area of origin. Which one is the most appropriate? The out-migration rate, because the denominator is the population in the area of origin who has the chance to experience the event of moving out from that area. If I go to the area of destination, the denominator here, the population, the population, the destination is already there. They don't have a chance to move there. But still, we have a lot of studies doing in-migration rates. It's usually easier to calculate. And it gives an idea of the level of migration because it takes into account the size of the population in the denominator. But technically, that the denominator is not appropriate because the people who are in the destination are not at risk of moving to the destination because they're already there, right? Net migration rate, number of in-migrants minus out, and you can also divide it by the population, the mean of the period. Gross migration rate, just to understand the overall flows, in plus out divided by the population, and all those multiplied by 1,000 because those rates are really small. And the migration efficiency, as I said before, that's the net migration divided by the gross migration, and it's reported in percentage terms, okay? So this is just explaining the in-out migration, the population. Cool. So we will start from here on Thursday. It's already 12:25. Thank you very much. And I see you guys on Thursday. The quiz is already open now, okay? And yeah, cool. Thank you.